One key point in this webinar is that in order to build and maintain trust in the workplace, or any place for that matter, is that trust is a two-way street. We need to be assessed as trustworthy by the people around us based on our words and actions, and we need to be able to trust others wisely, knowing we're dealing with fallible human beings who will not always live up to our standards for trustworthiness, even though they have the intention to do it. Being trustworthy and trusting wisely are both much easier when you have a clear, simple framework and language for trust that allows you to identify the behavior or the behaviors that build it and those that damage it. The framework I've written about in the Thin Book of Trust, and we'll talk about here, takes the abstract concept of trust and breaks it down into 4 distinct elements that can be directly connected to concrete behavior. Each of these elements is based on a different assessment related to trust. Just a quick word about assessments before we go on. An assessment is another word for belief or judgment or opinion. I think, as I've said, trust is the decision to make something I value vulnerable to another person's actions. This decision, as we said, is based on a risk assessment. But assessments are not facts. If I say, I don't trust Anne, I think she's a liar, I'm expressing an assessment about Anne. Anne may have lied about something once or 100 times. If I know for sure that she lied in the past, that is a fact that supports the validity of my assessment that she's a liar. But the assessment itself, she is a liar, is not a fact about Anne. It's a prediction about her future behavior based on what I know about her past behavior. So with that in mind, let's look at the 4 distinct ways that we all assess other people's trustworthiness and the way they assess ours. The first of these assessments is sincerity. This is an assessment that you speak honestly, you don't hide anything important, and your words and actions are aligned. Another way of talking about sincerity is to say that you are honest and act with integrity. People also sometimes consider it part of sincerity that when you give your opinion, you've thought it through, done your research, and can back it up with facts. We assess we can trust other people's sincerity based on what we know about how they have behaved in the past, what other people say about them, and if we can see or hear them, we also can assess based on the nonverbal information we take in when they speak. In other words, are their words aligned with their nonverbal communication? When people believe you aren't sincere, everything you say becomes suspect. And of course, your effectiveness at work then is pretty seriously diminished. If you want to be assessed as trustworthy in the area of sincerity, you can start by being honest with yourself. To be sincere requires also paying attention to what you say and do, being vigilant about not shading the truth or exaggerating or leaving out important information. It also means recognizing when, in the midst of all the busyness and competing commitments and imposing demands of work, you need to catch yourself before you say something you don't really mean. Or say something to one person and contradict it by what you say to someone else. Now that may seem pretty obvious, but you know, workplaces are crazy and we forget about this stuff easily if we're not paying attention. And we say something that we don't really mean, and then we have to figure out how to correct that. Or we say something to one person and we say something different to somebody else, and we don't go back and clear it up so that they both understand the same thing from us. Trusting wisely in the area of sincerity means noticing if the person you're deciding to trust often does any of the things I just mentioned. Lies, shades the truth, exaggerates, leaves out important stuff, says one thing to one person and then something different to another. Also, recognize any discrepancies between their words and body language if you happen to be watching them. Or not even recognizing, just simply watching for that kind of thing. There are some common and avoidable enemies of sincerity, if you will, mistakes that people make that can lead others to assess they're not sincere. Knowing which enemies of sincerity you tend to fall prey to will help you to avoid them. In the Thin Book of Trust, you can find examples of some of these common enemies of sincerity. Reliability is an assessment that you keep the specific commitments or promises that you make. A little bit different from sincerity. These are specific commitments. To be assessed as reliable requires managing those commitments well so that you can follow through on all of them. Realize that when you say yes to someone's request, you are making a commitment or a promise. The person you commit to expects you will be doing exactly what he or she has in mind when they ask you. This means it's critical that you understand exactly what that person has in mind, what they want you to do, how they expect you to do it, and when they want it completed, before you agree to doing it. And, in fact, not agreeing to doing it unless you really believe you can deliver. To be assessed as reliable also means if you've made a commitment, or when you've made a commitment, and you realize you can't keep it, you have to go back to the person you made it to and let them know as soon as possible. Not waiting until it's due or past due and then saying, oh, I couldn't do it. You want to go to them ahead of time and say, there's a problem. I can't do this. I'm not going to make the deadline, or I'm not going to be able to do everything that you asked. Here's why. And how do we fix this? How do we make this better? That gives them a chance to calibrate and figure out what they can do on their end. Successfully managing commitments is much easier when you and others you work with make direct, complete requests of each other and respond in a way that sets up a clear commitment. A format for requests and responses that lead to clear commitments is covered in a separate webinar entitled Managing Commitments for Leadership Success. Being trustworthy in this domain means only making commitments you believe you can keep, keeping them to the best of your ability, and letting the person you've made a commitment to know if you're not going to be able to keep it. Trusting wisely means helping others determine their ability to complete commitments they make to you before they make them. Competence is the assessment that you have the capacity, skills, knowledge, and resources to do the job, whatever it is, successfully. Being assessed as competent means you meet the standard of competence held by the person making the assessment. In other words, if you agree to do something but fail to deliver to the standards that other person holds for that task or job or function, that person may assess they can't trust your competence. Competence, interestingly, is considered by many in our Western business culture to be a basic source of trust. Someone who demonstrates competence in one skill or skill set is often assumed to be competent in others without having to first prove themselves. We also tend to automatically consider someone whose competence we trust to also be sincere and reliable. Being trustworthy in this area means demonstrating competence in the skill or task or job or whatever based on whatever standard is being used. So you have to actually live up to that standard, demonstrate it. Given this, it's critical that you understand what the standard is. Being trustworthy also means acknowledging when you realize you're not sufficiently competent in a particular area of work or skill set, and asking for help if you need it. Trusting wisely means being clear about the job, task, skill, or skill set for which you are assessing someone's competence. In other words, knowing if I'm expecting someone to be competent in the area of some technical skill set, I'm clear that that's what I'm asking them to be competent in, and I'm not confusing it with their ability, for example, to be a good manager. Someone who's highly competent in a technical skill, for example, in fact, may not be competent at managing people and may need coaching or training or mentoring until they develop sufficient competence. Trusting wisely also means checking with the other person to determine if they have the same standards as you do. One final point. We're not always aware of our own standards for judging competence. When there is a question about competence, the first thing you should do is to come to agreement about the skill or skill set you're assessing and what standards you're actually using. Care is the assessment that you have my interests, or at least our mutual interests, in mind when you make decisions and take action. In the work setting, it's very important to most people that they believe their immediate supervisor and, ideally, other senior managers in the company have their interests in mind. In a team, care can simply be an assessment that everyone has the team's interests in mind as well as their own. When people assess you have their interests in mind as well as your own, it gives you freedom to make decisions and take action on your own and still maintain trust. If people don't believe you have their interests in mind, they're going to watch you like a hawk. The assessment of care is a precondition for positive engagement with and strong commitment to an individual leader, a team, and or in many cases the entire organization. In other words, if you believe that those people, that leader, the people on the team, the top management of the organization, actually have at least your common interests in mind, common concerns, then you're much more likely to want to engage with them and commit to them. Demonstrating trustworthiness in the area of care means listening to, identifying, and acknowledging other people's interests and concerns. It may also mean identifying common values and concerns and goals that you have, that you share, and acknowledging differences while maintaining open communication. Demonstrating care does not always mean agreeing with others. It does mean seeking alignment around shared values, concerns, and goals. Trusting wisely in the area of care means gently asking hard questions and probing to find areas of common concern. It also means observing others to determine if they act in support of your interests, or at least your common interests, as well as their own, or if they act primarily in service to their own interests.